I remember the way the refrigerator hummed that night. It was louder than usual, or perhaps the silence around it made it seem that way. The kitchen existed in that strange liminal space between day and night, where shadows gathered in corners and familiar objects took on unfamiliar shapes. The digital clock on the microwave cast its green glow across the counter, reading 11:47 p.m. Clara had been asleep for over an hour. My phone lay face down beside the coffee maker, its screen illuminating the granite surface beneath it. I could see the message glowing through the glass back, those 5 words that had arrived 20 minutes earlier and changed everything. Friends can do this, right? The question mark seemed to pulse with each breath I took, a small punctuation mark carrying the weight of decades. I stood there in my bare feet, wearing the same gray pajama pants I had worn to bed for the past 3 years. The kitchen felt enormous around me, larger than it had any right to be. Every surface reflected some version of the life I had built. The refrigerator door displayed our children's artwork, faded now and curling at the edges. Soccer schedules held down by magnetic letters that once spelled out birthday messages. A grocery list in Clara's careful handwriting. Evidence of a family, of routine, of the 1,000 small decisions that create a life. But in that moment, standing in the half-darkness with that message burning through my phone, all of it felt distant. Borrowed, somehow. As if I had been living in someone else's house, wearing someone else's clothes, speaking someone else's words for so long that I had forgotten the sound of my own voice. I reached for the phone, then stopped. My wedding ring caught the light from the microwave clock, a thin band of gold that had worn smooth after 18 years. I found myself turning it around my finger, testing its weight, the way it moved against my skin. It had never felt heavy before. Tonight, it felt like an anchor. The message had come from Malcolm. Malcolm, who I had not spoken to in 20 years until last week's reunion. Malcolm, whose number I had entered into my phone with trembling fingers in a hotel parking lot, telling myself it was just nostalgia, just the desire to maintain a connection with an old friend. Nothing more than that. Never more than that. I lifted the phone and read the message again. The words were so simple, so innocent on their surface. An invitation disguised as uncertainty. The kind of thing you could explain away, could dismiss, could pretend meant something else entirely. But I knew better. In the space between those words lived everything we had never said to each other in college, everything we had carefully avoided naming, everything that had made us both look away at crucial moments. The house settled around me with small creaks and sighs. Upstairs, Clara shifted in her sleep, and I heard the soft rustle of sheets. She would wake in the morning and find me already at the kitchen table with my coffee and newspaper, the same position I had occupied every morning for years. She would kiss the top of my head absently and begin her day, never knowing that I had stood in this kitchen and felt my entire world tilt on its axis. I whispered the message aloud, testing how the words felt in my mouth. Friends can do this, right? My voice sounded strange in the empty kitchen, younger somehow, as if speaking those words had transported me back 20 years to a dorm room where Malcolm and I had stayed up until dawn, talking about everything except the thing that mattered most. Even then, I think I knew there was no going back. That once you acknowledge the fault lines in your life, once you feel them shifting beneath your feet, you cannot pretend the ground is solid anymore. The carefully constructed normalcy of my days suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. One touch, one honest word, one moment of courage, and it would all tear apart. I set the phone back down without responding, but I did not turn it face up. Some part of me understood that seeing those words again would make them more real, would force me to confront what they were really asking. Instead, I stood there in the humming darkness, a 42-year-old man in his own kitchen, feeling like a stranger in his own life, knowing that everything was about to change. The morning came as it always did. Coffee at 7:15, black with 1 sugar, the same ceramic mug Clara had given me for our 10th anniversary. The newspaper folded to the business section, though I rarely absorbed more than headlines anymore. My children's voices drifted down from upstairs, arguing over bathroom time with the casual intensity that only siblings could muster. This was my life. This was the life I had built, brick by careful brick, over the course of 20 years. I am 42 years old, an accountant at a firm downtown where I have worked for the past 14 years. I drive a silver Honda Accord that I wash every other Sunday. My house sits on Maple Street in a neighborhood where lawns are maintained with religious devotion and Christmas lights appear in perfectly coordinated displays each December. By any measure, I live a life that others would envy. Stable, predictable, safe. The hallway leading from the kitchen to the front door tells the story in photographs. Wedding pictures where Clara and I look impossibly young, her dress a cascade of white silk, my smile wide and certain. Birthday parties with cake-smeared faces and gap-toothed grins. School photos documenting the gradual transformation of our children from round-faced toddlers to the angular teenagers they were becoming. Christmas mornings, graduations, family vacations to beaches where we built sandcastles and collected shells that now gather dust in a jar on the mantel. But when I study these photographs, really look at them, I feel like I am viewing evidence of someone else's life. There I am in each frame, smiling at appropriate moments, my arm around Clara's shoulders, my hand resting on my children's heads, but something in my eyes always seems distant. As if I am posing for a role I never quite learned to inhabit completely. Clara moves through our shared space with the efficiency of long practice. She manages our social calendar, coordinates carpool schedules, leads the church choir with a voice that remains beautiful even after all these years. She is kind in ways that matter, patient with our children's moods, generous with neighbors who need help, devoted to causes that serve others. Our marriage is not marked by cruelty or dramatic conflict. It simply exists in a state of gentle numbness, like a song sung without conviction, the notes correct but the passion long since faded. My days follow a rhythm so precise it could be measured with a metronome. Alarm at 6:30. Shower, shave, dress in one of 7 nearly identical gray suits. Commute at 7:45, arriving at the office by 8:15 if traffic cooperates. Numbers on spreadsheets until lunch, then more numbers until 5 o'clock. The drive home through suburbs where houses mirror my own, each one containing families living variations of the same careful script. But beneath this routine, beneath the reliable cadence of my constructed life, something else moves. A current I have never named, never acknowledged, but always felt. It surfaces in unexpected moments. When I catch myself watching other men a heartbeat too long. When certain songs on the radio create an ache I cannot explain. When I wake from dreams I can never quite remember, but that leave me feeling both hollow and homesick for a place I have never been. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried between utility bills and credit card offers. Alumni reunion, class of 2003. 20 years since graduation. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me pause. The list of confirmed attendees scrolled past familiar names, faces from a time when life felt full of infinite possibility. And then I saw it. Malcolm Chun. The name hit me like a physical force, knocking the breath from my lungs in a way I could not have anticipated. I had not thought of Malcolm in years. Or perhaps that is not entirely true. Perhaps I had thought of him too often, in those quiet moments between sleep and waking when defenses are down and the mind wanders where it should not go. Malcolm, who had been my roommate sophomore year. Malcolm, who stayed up with me until dawn talking about philosophy and dreams and the weight of expectations we carried like invisible chains. Malcolm, whose laugh could fill a room and whose presence had made me feel both completely safe and dangerously exposed. We had been close in the way that young men sometimes are before the world teaches them to maintain appropriate distances. Close enough that others occasionally made jokes we pretended not to understand. Close enough that when he transferred schools junior year, I felt his absence like a phantom limb for months afterward. Close enough that I had carefully avoided thinking about what that closeness might have meant, building my life deliberately around the certainty that such questions were better left unasked. Now, 20 years later, sitting in my kitchen with my coffee growing cold and my ordinary life spread around me like evidence in a case I was no longer sure I wanted to solve, I stared at his name on that email, and felt something I had spent decades learning to suppress rise up in my chest like a tide returning to shore. I almost did not go. For 3 weeks after receiving that email, I invented excuses. Work deadlines that could not be moved. A family obligation that suddenly seemed urgent. The simple truth that 20 years was too long, that some doors were better left closed. Clara encouraged me to attend, said it would be good for me to reconnect with old friends, but she could not have understood the weight of my hesitation. The night before the reunion, I stood in front of my closet holding 2 different ties, paralyzed by a decision that should have been simple. What did one wear to confront the past? How did one dress for the possibility of seeing the person who had once made you feel most like yourself? I chose the blue one, the same color Malcolm had once said brought out my eyes, though I told myself the memory was coincidence. The hotel banquet hall buzzed with the particular energy of middle-aged people trying to reconcile their current selves with who they used to be. Name tags with graduation photos reminded us all of the smooth-faced optimists we had once been. I moved through the crowd making appropriate noises, shaking hands with classmates whose names I struggled to remember, discussing mortgages and children's college plans with the weary enthusiasm expected of such occasions. And then I saw him. Malcolm stood near the bar, and 20 years collapsed into nothing. He was older, certainly, broader through the shoulders, his hair streaked with distinguished gray at the temples. Lines around his eyes spoke of laughter and worry and the accumulation of decades. But when he turned and our eyes met across that crowded room, his smile was exactly the same. The smile that had once made me feel both completely safe and dangerously exposed. He approached with the easy confidence I remembered, though something in his posture seemed more settled now, as if he had finally grown comfortable in his own skin in a way that had eluded him in college. We embraced briefly, the kind of hug acceptable between old friends, but I felt the electric shock of contact run through me like recognition. Our conversation began safely. Work, he told me. He had become an architect, designed buildings that changed skylines in cities I had only read about. I spoke of my accounting practice, my family, the ordinary markers of a life lived according to plan. We talked about mutual friends, professors we remembered, the way the campus had changed since our time there. The comfortable small talk of middle-aged men who had once known each other well, but had learned to maintain appropriate distances. But beneath the surface politeness, I felt something else moving. The way his eyes lingered on my face when I spoke. The way he leaned closer when the music grew loud. The familiar rhythm of our conversation, picking up after 20 years as if it had been 20 minutes. By the time the evening wound down, we had drifted away from the crowd, finding ourselves in quieter corners where our words could carry more weight. In the parking lot, under the harsh glare of security lights, we lingered beside our cars. The reunion was ending. People calling goodbyes and promising to stay in touch with the hollow enthusiasm of those who knew they would not. Malcolm stood with his hands in his pockets, and I recognized the gesture from college, the way he used to stand when he had something important to say but was not sure how to begin. He told me he was divorced, said it casually, as if it were just another piece of biographical information, but I heard the weight beneath the words. 2 years now, he said, amicable, for the sake of their daughter. He paused then, studying my face in the artificial light, and added that he had often thought of me over the years. Wondered how I was. Wondered if I was happy. The question hung between us like a challenge. I could have deflected it, turned it back to him, made some joke about the passage of time. Instead, I found myself telling him the truth. That happiness felt like too simple a word for the complexity of a life built on compromise. That sometimes I felt like I was living someone else's story, playing a role I had never quite learned to inhabit convincingly. He nodded as if he understood exactly what I meant. As if he too had spent decades learning to speak in careful euphemisms, to live in the spaces between what was said and what was felt. We exchanged numbers then, our phones held between us like offerings. He promised to call, said we should catch up properly sometime. Coffee, he suggested. Just 2 old friends reconnecting. I drove home through empty streets, my hands gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, my mind replaying every word, every gesture, every moment when our conversation had veered towards something deeper than nostalgia. Clara was asleep when I arrived, and I stood in our bathroom brushing my teeth, studying my reflection and wondering if she would notice any change in me, any evidence of the fault lines that had begun to show. A week later, the text arrived. 5 simple words that carried the weight of everything we had not said to each other in that parking lot, everything we had been too careful to name. Friends can do this, right? An invitation wrapped in uncertainty, a question that was really a statement, a door opening onto a truth I had spent 20 years learning to avoid. What began as coffee became something else entirely, though I could not have named it then. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where conversations could unfold without interruption, where 2 middle-aged men catching up would draw no particular attention. Malcolm arrived 5 minutes early, as he always had in college, and I found him already seated by the window, studying the street outside with the same quiet intensity one remembered. That first meeting felt like archaeology. We excavated shared memories carefully, handling them like fragile artifacts that might crumble if examined too closely. Professors we had loved and hated. Late nights in the library during finals week. The terrible cafeteria food we had somehow learned to tolerate. Safe territory, the common ground of people who had once known each other well, but were now learning to navigate the distance that 20 years had created. But even then, beneath the careful politeness, I felt something stirring. The way Malcolm listened when I spoke, his attention complete and unwavering in a way that made me remember what it felt like to be truly heard. The way he laughed at my stories, not the polite chuckle of social obligation, but genuine delight that lit up his entire face. When he reached across the table to touch my arm as he made a point, the contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds too long, and I felt electricity ripple through me like recognition. One coffee became dinner the following week. Dinner became regular meetings, always in public places, always with the careful explanation of old friends reconnecting. The texts began then, arriving at odd hours when I should have been focused on other things. Simple messages at first. A photo of a building he had designed that reminded him of something we had discussed. A link to an article about our old professor who had finally published his novel. Observations about the weather, about traffic, about the small absurdities of daily life that somehow felt profound when filtered through his particular way of seeing the world. I found myself checking my phone more frequently than I should have, feeling a small thrill each time his name appeared on the screen. Clara noticed my distraction but attributed it to work stress, offering the kind of gentle concern that only highlighted how little she truly knew about the storm gathering inside me. I told myself it was friendship, nothing more complicated than the natural pleasure of reconnecting with someone who had once mattered to me. The evening everything changed began innocently enough. Dinner at a restaurant neither of us had tried before. Conversation that meandered through topics both serious and trivial. Malcolm spoke about his daughter, how the divorce had affected her, the careful balance he was learning between honesty and protection. I shared my own struggles with parenthood, the way my children sometimes felt like beautiful strangers whose inner lives remained mysterious to me despite my best efforts to understand them. When the evening ended, Malcolm offered to drive me to my car, which I had left in a garage several blocks away. What should have been a 5-minute ride stretched into something much longer. We sat in his car in the empty garage, the engine off, both of us reluctant to end the conversation. The darkness felt intimate in a way that daylight never allowed, creating a space where words could carry different weight. He told me about the loneliness of his post-divorce life, how silence had become both refuge and prison. I found myself confessing things I had never said aloud. How sometimes I felt like I was watching my own life from a distance, participating but never fully present. How the routine that had once felt comforting now seemed like a trap I had built for myself with meticulous care. Malcolm turned to face me then, and in the dim light of the parking garage, I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. Recognition, perhaps, or permission. When he spoke my name, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and I felt something inside me respond like a tuning fork struck at exactly the right frequency. Our conversations began to take on a different texture after that night. The texts arrived more frequently, often late in the evening when my family slept and I sat alone in my study pretending to work on spreadsheets that held no meaning for me anymore. Malcolm would send observations about his day, questions about mine, fragments of memory that connected us across the years. I found myself responding with an honesty that both thrilled and terrified me. My world began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. Numbers on computer screens blurred as I lost myself in thoughts of our next meeting. Conversations at home drifted past me like background noise while I mentally rehearsed things I wanted to tell Malcolm. Clara's voice seemed to come from very far away, even when she stood directly beside me asking about dinner plans or weekend obligations. I began to notice things I had trained myself not to see. The way Malcolm's eyes crinkled when he smiled. The same pattern I remembered from 20 years ago, but now etched deeper by time and experience. How he had a habit of touching my shoulder when he made a point, his hand lingering just long enough to send heat spreading through my chest. The way he said my name, with a particular inflection that made it sound like something precious being carefully handled. I resisted these observations even as I cataloged them. I told myself that men were allowed to care for each other, that friendship between adults could be deep and meaningful without crossing lines that should not be crossed. I reminded myself of my responsibilities, my family, the life I had built with such deliberate care. I constructed elaborate justifications for the way I felt when I was with him, the way anticipation of our meetings had begun to color my entire week. But resistance was becoming more difficult. Each time Malcolm leaned closer across a dinner table, each time our laughter hung in the air a moment too long, each time I caught him studying my face with an expression I was afraid to interpret, I felt the careful boundaries I had maintained for decades begin to tremble like fault lines under pressure. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. I was alive in a way I had not been for years, perhaps had never been. In Malcolm's presence, I felt like myself in a way that was both familiar and entirely new, as if I were finally inhabiting my own life instead of merely observing it from a careful distance. The recognition was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a door opening onto a version of myself I had spent 20 years learning to deny. The evening that changed everything began like all the others. Dinner at a quiet restaurant where the lighting was soft and conversations could unfold without interruption. But something felt different from the moment Malcolm arrived. There was an intensity in his manner, a weight to his silences that suggested he had come with something specific to say. We ordered wine, then more wine, and our conversation took on the particular honesty that alcohol sometimes permits. Malcolm spoke about his marriage, how it had ended not in dramatic confrontation, but in the gradual recognition that they had been living parallel lives that never quite intersected. I found myself talking about Clara with a candor that surprised me, admitting that our relationship had become more ritual than romance, more habit than choice. The restaurant emptied around us as we talked, our voices growing softer as the space became more intimate. Malcolm told me about the years after he transferred schools, how he had often wondered what might have happened if he had stayed, how our friendship had been something he measured other relationships against, never quite finding that same easy connection, that sense of being completely understood without having to explain himself. I admitted that I had felt his absence more than I should have, that the semester after he left had felt somehow diminished, as if the colors had been drained from everything. We were treading close to dangerous territory, but the wine had loosened the careful controls I usually maintained. For once, I allowed myself to speak without filtering every word through the lens of what was appropriate, what was safe. When the evening finally ended, Malcolm walked me to my car as he often did. The night air was heavy with the promise of rain, thick and humid in a way that made everything feel charged with possibility. We moved slowly through the empty streets, both reluctant to end what felt like a significant conversation, though neither of us could have articulated exactly what had been significant about it. My car sat alone under a streetlight, the rest of the block dark and quiet. We stopped beside it, and I fumbled for my keys, suddenly aware of how close Malcolm was standing, how the silence between us had taken on a different quality. It was not the comfortable quiet of old friends, but something heavier, more expectant. He spoke my name then, so softly I almost missed it. When I turned to face him, I saw something in his expression that made my heart begin to race. Recognition, perhaps, or decision. He moved closer, and I should have stepped away, should have broken the moment with some comment about the lateness of the hour or the responsibilities waiting for us both at home. Instead, I found myself frozen, watching as he lifted his hand and placed it gently over mine where I held my car keys. His touch was warm, deliberate, and I felt the contact like electricity running straight to my core. "Friends can do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I knew he was not talking about the simple gesture of touching my hand. Everything that happened next felt inevitable, as if 20 years of careful distance had been building toward this single moment. My body betrayed me, leaning forward before my mind could intervene, before common sense could reassert itself. The kiss was brief, perhaps lasting only seconds, but it contained within it everything we had never said to each other, everything we had spent decades avoiding. His lips were soft, tentative at first, then more certain as I responded despite myself. For that brief moment, the careful construction of my adult life fell away completely. I was 22 again, standing in a dorm room with Malcolm, finally giving voice to feelings I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. The kiss tasted like honesty, like coming home to a place I had never let myself visit. Reality crashed back into me like cold water. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth as if I could somehow take back what had just happened. The world seemed to spin around me, the streetlight above casting strange shadows that made everything feel surreal and immediate at the same time. "I can't," I whispered, the words coming out as barely more than breath. Malcolm did not try to follow me, did not reach for me again. He simply stood there in the yellow circle of light, his expression holding a quiet understanding that was somehow worse than any argument would have been, as if he already knew what I was going to say before I said it, as if he had been expecting this moment of panic, this retreat into the safety of denial. I drove home through empty streets, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind replaying those few seconds over and over like a film stuck on repeat. The taste of him lingered on my lips, and I found myself touching my mouth repeatedly, trying to convince myself that what had happened was real, that I had not imagined the entire encounter. Clara was asleep when I arrived home, and I stood for a long time in our bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror above the sink. The harsh fluorescent light revealed every line in my face, every mark that 20 years of careful living had left behind. My wedding ring caught the light and threw it back at me like an accusation. In that moment, standing alone in the bathroom of the house I had bought with my wife, surrounded by the evidence of the life we had built together, I finally understood something I had been avoiding for decades. What I had felt for Malcolm in college, what I was feeling for him now, had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting, patient and unyielding, for this moment of recognition. I had spent 20 years constructing a life that looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Marriage, children, career, house in the suburbs with a lawn I mowed every Sunday. I had followed the script perfectly, hit every mark, played the role with conviction. But standing there in that harsh light, I could no longer pretend that the life I had built was the same as the life I actually wanted. The kiss had lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it had undone 20 years of careful construction, revealing the fault lines that had always been there, waiting for the right pressure to make them visible. There was no going back now, no way to unknow what I had learned about myself in that brief moment of honesty. The door had been opened, and I could not close it again. The days that followed felt like living with a secret that was slowly consuming me from the inside. I moved through my routines with mechanical precision, but everything felt different now, as if I were seeing my life through a lens that had been adjusted to reveal details I had spent years learning to ignore. The kiss had lasted 10 seconds, but it had shattered something fundamental about the way I understood myself. I could not unknow what I now knew. Every morning I woke beside Clara. Every evening I sat at our dinner table, Every night, I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling. I felt the weight of that knowledge pressing against my chest like a physical thing. The carefully constructed normalcy of my days had become a performance I could no longer give convincingly. Clara noticed my distance, though she attributed it to work stress at first. She would touch my shoulder as I sat reading the newspaper, ask if everything was all right with a concern that only highlighted how far I had already drifted from her. I wanted to tell her the truth, but the words seemed impossible to form. How do you explain to the mother of your children that the foundation of your shared life has revealed itself to be built on sand? Our children moved through the house with their usual energy, arguing over television channels and homework assignments, their laughter echoing from the living room while I sat in my study pretending to review financial reports. They were beautiful, innocent, completely unaware of the storm gathering in their father's silence. The thought of disrupting their world, of becoming the source of chaos in their carefully ordered lives, made me feel physically ill. But the alternative felt equally impossible. I had tasted something that night with Malcolm, a version of myself that felt more authentic than anything I had experienced in decades. The brief moment of honesty had revealed just how much of myself I had been withholding, not just from others, but from my own recognition. Living with that knowledge while maintaining the pretense of my marriage felt like slow suffocation. I avoided Malcolm's calls for a week, letting them go to voicemail without listening to his messages. But avoidance solved nothing. The truth had been spoken between us, and it could not be taken back simply by refusing to acknowledge it. When he finally texted asking if we could meet, just to talk, I knew I could not run from the conversation forever. We met at the same coffee shop where this had all begun, though it felt like years had passed since that first innocent reunion. Malcolm looked tired, older somehow, as if the uncertainty of the past week had aged him in ways that years had not. He did not try to pretend that nothing had changed between us. Instead, he waited for me to speak, his patience both generous and unbearable. I told him about the fear that had been consuming me. Fear of losing my family, of destroying the life I had built with such deliberate care, of becoming someone I no longer recognized. I spoke about my children, how the thought of explaining this to them made me feel like I was drowning. I admitted that I had spent 20 years believing I had successfully buried this part of myself, only to discover that burial and death are not the same thing. But I also told him the truth that I could no longer deny, that when he kissed me, it had felt like breathing after years underwater. That in his presence, I felt like myself in a way that was both familiar and entirely new. That the person I became when I was with him felt more real than the person I had been playing for the past 2 decades. Malcolm listened without interrupting, his expression holding a compassion that made my confession both easier and more difficult. When I finally stopped talking, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his, a gesture so simple and natural that it nearly undid me completely. He told me he understood the fear, had lived with his own version of it for years. He spoke about his marriage, how it had ended not because of cruelty or dramatic betrayal, but because of the slow recognition that they were both living half-lives, loving each other as much as they were capable, but never completely, never with their whole selves engaged. The cost of authenticity revealed itself in our conversation like an equation with no easy solution. To stay meant continuing to live as a fraction of myself, maintaining a lie that grew heavier each day. To leave meant risking everything I had built, destroying the security my family depended on, venturing into territory I had never allowed myself to explore. But as we sat there, Malcolm's hand warm over mine, our conversation carrying the weight of 20 years of unspoken truth, I realized that the choice had already been made. Not in that moment, but in the accumulation of moments that had led us there. In every text I had answered, every dinner I had agreed to, every time I had allowed myself to feel truly seen by another person. I could not go back to pretending. The pretense had become more exhausting than the truth, and I was tired of living like a stranger in my own life. When I looked at Malcolm across that small table, I saw not just the person I had feelings for, but a mirror reflecting the person I could be if I stopped being afraid of my own truth. I chose honesty, trembling and uncertain, but finally unwilling to continue the lie that had been slowly killing the most authentic parts of myself. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff I had been standing on for 20 years, finally ready to discover whether I could fly or would simply learn to fall with grace. The conversation with Clara happened late at night, in our kitchen where so much of our life together had unfolded. She sat across from me at the table where we had shared thousands of meals, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. I told her everything, not with the dramatic flair of television confessions, but with the quiet honesty that our 20 years together deserved. She cried, of course, not with surprise, she said, but with the grief of finally having confirmed what some part of her had always known. She spoke about the distance she had felt growing between us, how she had attributed it to middle age, to the natural settling that happens in long marriages. She had not wanted to look closer, had not wanted to see what that distance really meant. We talked until dawn, sometimes in anger, sometimes in sorrow, but mostly with the strange relief that comes from finally speaking truth that has been too long buried. She asked if I loved him, and I told her I thought I did, though love seemed too simple a word for something so complicated. She asked if I had ever loved her, and I could honestly say yes, though I now understood it had been a different kind of love than either of us deserved. When the conversation finally ended, she removed her wedding ring and placed it on the counter beside mine. Two small circles of gold that represented the end of one story and the beginning of something neither of us could yet imagine. There were no dramatic declarations, no slamming doors. Only the quiet acknowledgement that we had both been living a life that no longer fit. I packed a small bag that morning, taking only what I needed for a few days. The larger decisions would come later, the lawyers and custody arrangements and division of a life that had taken 20 years to build. For now, it was enough to step outside the performance I had been giving for so long, to stop pretending that I could continue indefinitely as someone I was not. The house felt different as I moved through it, gathering clothes and toiletries with the mechanical efficiency of a man checking out of a hotel. My children were at school, spared for now from witnessing this moment of dissolution. I would talk to them later, when I had found the words to explain something I was still learning to understand myself. Clara watched from the kitchen window as I loaded my car, her face composed but distant, as if she were already practicing the art of seeing me as someone from her past rather than her present. I wanted to go to her, to offer some comfort or assurance, but we had moved beyond the territory where such gestures had meaning. Some endings require silence. I drove to the overlook where Malcolm and I had agreed to meet, a quiet spot above the city where lights stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He was already there when I arrived, sitting on the hood of his car, his posture uncertain but open, as if he too was unsure what this moment should look like. I parked beside him and stepped into the cool evening air, my chest tight with a mixture of fear and anticipation I could not untangle. We did not immediately speak. Sometimes the most important conversations begin with silence, with the simple act of standing together in a space where honesty is finally possible. When he did speak, it was not with promises or declarations, but with a simple acknowledgement of what we were both feeling. Fear about the future, grief for what we had lost in getting here, hope for what might be possible now that we had stopped running from ourselves. We were two men in their 40s, standing at the edge of their own truth, finally ready to discover who they might become. The city lights blurred below us, thousands of windows holding thousands of lives, each one a story of choices made and paths taken. I thought about the life I had just left behind, the one I had built with such careful precision, and felt not regret but a deep exhale, as if I had been holding my breath for 20 years and could finally let it go. Malcolm moved closer, not touching but simply present, and I felt something settle inside me that I had not even realized was agitated. This was not the ending of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one written in a voice I was finally ready to claim as my own. There were no promises between us, no declarations of what would happen next. The future remained uncertain, full of complications and challenges neither of us could yet imagine. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt present in my own life, standing exactly where I belonged, finally brave enough to be exactly who I was.